Simon Johnson, former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, and Catherine Wolfram, a former deputy assistant secretary for climate and energy economics at the Treasury Department, are professors at MIT Sloan School of Management. An unfortunate fact about oil markets is that all petrostates profit from violence, whether they perpetrate it themselves or benefit when other petrostates do. And that creates a conundrum for U.S. policymakers: how to punish Iran for its suspected assistance to Hamas without helping Russia during its war on Ukraine. Our solution: impose a price cap on Iran's oil exports. Here's our thinking. Russia is one of the largest oil exporters in the world, about 8 million barrels per day. World consumption is about 100 million barrels per day. After its brutal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, world oil prices rose sharply, from about $80 per barrel to more than $120 per barrel. The main driver was fear that Russian oil would come off the market because of sanctions imposed by countries such as the United States or because of physical disruptions related to the war. In the end, the fear was worse than the reality, and Russia was able to sell its usual oil volumes at a war premium created by a conflict that it started. For the first 9 months after the invasion, Russia earned almost 50% more from oil exports than it had in 2021. Then, in December 2022, the Group of Seven and the European Union instituted a price cap of $60 per barrel on Russian oil and significantly limited Russia's revenue without cutting off its exports, keeping world oil prices flat. Oil markets are now focused on Iran, also one of the world's largest exporters, at about 2 million barrels per day recently. As is true in Russia, oil funds a significant share of the Iranian government, part of which has historically supported Hamas. Some members of Congress have called for stricter measures to limit Iran's oil revenue, although statements from the Biden administration indicate that it is still gathering evidence linking Iran to Hamas's horrific terrorist attacks against Israel. On October 17, 10 days after the attacks, oil prices were more than 5% higher than the day before the attacks, suggesting that some market participants are concerned about steps against Iran or other disruptions to oil exports from the region. So far, Iran is benefiting from these concerns. Simple math suggests that at current oil prices, close to $90 per barrel, Iran would earn about $1 billion every 6 days from its oil exports. Even if it must sell oil at some discount, due to increased stigma and potential repercussions, it would still be able to replace the $6 billion in Qatari accounts, recently frozen by Washington, in a matter of weeks. These funds are previous earnings from Iranian oil exports that can be used only for humanitarian purposes. To punish oil exporters, policymakers have traditionally turned to sanctions that make it illegal to buy oil from the target country. In 2019 and 2020, Iranian exports were reduced by about 75% due to US-led sanctions in response to Iran's nuclear activities. Even if this is possible today, it's not clear that Western policymakers would want to constrain Iranian exports to those depressed levels again. Taking 75% of Iran's oil off the market could, by our estimate, drive oil prices up by between $10 and $20 per barrel. This harms the world economy and helps Russia. In a well-timed development, the U.S. Treasury announced on October 12 that it was stepping up enforcement of the price cap on Russian oil and had sanctioned several tanker companies for transporting oil above the price cap. The more barrels of Russian oil that transact at the price cap, the less Russia benefits from increases in world prices tied to the unrest in the Middle East. This is helpful, but squeezes just Russia. How can we protect the global economy from higher oil prices while punishing Iran? One approach would be to apply a version of the price cap to Iran. The Russian price cap is designed to keep oil on the world market while reducing the revenue of an aggressive regime. Iran is already under secondary sanctions, meaning that not just Iran but also anyone doing business with it can be sanctioned, including being excluded from the U.S. financial system. A logical modification could be to allow oil transactions with Iran, but only if the price paid is less than a stipulated cap, which could be $60 per barrel, but probably should be lower, and subject any parties involved in transactions above the cap to secondary sanctions. Any price cap above the cost of Iranian production, about $10 per barrel, would encourage continued supply, because Iran needs as much cash as possible to keep its regime functioning. Organizations such as tankertrackers.com do an excellent job of following the path of oil shipments out of Iran. It is hard to hide an oil tanker or disguise how much it carried to its destination. A cap could be enforced by requiring that the tanker owner, a matter of public record, pay a toll per barrel equal to the difference between current world prices and the price cap. The United States would publish a list of oil shipments that have paid this toll. Secondary sanctions would then apply to anyone dealing with any Iranian shipment who was not on that list. If the buyer paid no more than the price cap and could provide proper proof, the tanker owner could apply for a rebate of the toll. This suggestion would be a novel extension of the Russian oil price cap, which was already a breakthrough in thinking about the global economy. The toll enforcing the Iranian oil price cap would not be easy to implement. But facing two wars involving major oil exporters, U.S. policymakers don't have many good options. We need to break the cycle of petrostates benefiting from fomenting violence. And when we punish one petrostate, we need to be careful not to reward another. On Israel, DeSantis acted while Trump just acted out. When the full history of the Israel-Gaza war is written, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' decision to partner with a nonprofit that specializes in bringing U.S. citizens home from conflict zones will be just a small detail. But that decision not only helped bring 270 U.S. citizens from Tel Aviv to Tampa, it also put on vivid display the sort of stark choices facing Republicans as the 2024 GOP primary season looms. The Florida state government's airlift partner was Project Dynamo, a veteran-led organization formed to help rescue people in Afghanistan after the United States withdrew troops in 2021. The group also aided the evacuation of Americans from Ukraine after Russia's 2022 invasion. Florida's move, after the massive Hamas attack on October 7, was a calculated gamble. Hamas claimed responsibility for a rocket attack targeting Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport, and many airlines suspended flights to and from Israel. The Miami Herald noted that Tampa-based Project Dynamo has been criticized by U.S. government officials for being too willing to take risks. But there wasn't any risk-free option for getting these people out. They had to live with the risk of trying to leave through the evacuation flight, or live with the risks of staying as Hamas rockets targeted Israel. I think if you were watching, you saw a lot of families with young kids. So, a lot of these people were in a real pinch. They had no help. They were not able to get out of Israel, and the state of Florida stepped up, DeSantis told reporters. Governors can't do a lot when there's a terrible foreign policy crisis, but DeSantis figured out a way to help Floridians stuck in Israel. Most GOP presidential candidates issued a statement denouncing Hamas and pledging support for Israel, but DeSantis managed to actually do something. Even if it was only the relatively minor matter of getting 179 adults, 91 children and 2 dogs out of harm's way, he earned the right to take a bow. Contrast that with Donald Trump, far and away the most likely Republican presidential nominee. For days after the Hamas attack, the former president leapt into action, praising Israel's enemies as very smart and venting his spleen about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu supposedly backing out of helping with the ultimately successful U.S. drone strike in 2020 against top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. Trump was at his Mar-a-Lago resort in South Florida, making long, rambling remarks to his adoring Club 47 fan club. I'll reproduce them here at length, to provide the full, statesmanlike flavor. I'll never forget that Bibi Netanyahu let us down, that was a very terrible thing, I will say that. And, so when I see, sometimes, the intelligence, you talk about the intelligence, or you talk about some of the things that went wrong over the last week, they've got to straighten it out because they're fighting, potentially, a very big force, they're fighting potentially Iran, and when they have people saying the wrong things, everything they say is being digested by these people, because they're vicious and they're smart, and boy are they vicious, because nobody's ever seen the kind of sight that we've seen, nobody's ever seen it, but they cannot play games, so we were disappointed by that, very disappointed, but we did the job ourselves, and it was absolute precision and magnificent, beautiful job, and then, Bibi tried to take credit for it, that didn't make me feel too good, but that's alright. Note that Trump didn't explain why the United States would need Israeli cooperation or sign off on an effort to take out an Iranian figure on Iraqi soil. And, in any case, NBC News reported, after the speech, that 3 U.S. officials familiar with the operation's planning said Trump's description was simply false. Israel was never going to participate in the strike, fearing it would be dangerous and destabilizing. Taking out Soleimani turned out to be a big U.S. military success, and yet here we are, more than 3 years later, with Trump airing grievances about an apparently imaginary betrayal when Israel is experiencing one of its darkest hours and worldwide fears of a greater conflict are palpable. DeSantis has shown some faults since announcing his bid for the Republican nomination, describing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a territorial dispute was a boneheaded, self-inflicted wound. But he was re-elected in 2022 in a landslide because he gets things done for Floridians, which DeSantis decisively showed again with the Israel airlift. DeSantis might or might not turn out to be the best GOP alternative to Trump, but his recent conduct, in contrast with Trump's bellyaching about Israel, underlined what's at stake if Republicans continue on their current course. Trump is a fundamentally unserious person running for the presidency in a deadly serious world. In 2 votes, the ultra-conservative provocateur Representative Jim Jordan failed to convince enough fellow Republicans that he is worthy of becoming House Speaker. They're right to resist his elevation. His allies pushed anti-Jordan holdouts to cave by emphasizing the need for stability, but he has been a force for instability his entire congressional career. Mr. Jordan, Ohio, coordinated closely with President Donald Trump to try to overturn the 2020 election. He never demonstrated seriousness about governing, when Representative Pete Aguilar, Democrat, California, noted during a Tuesday floor speech that Mr. Jordan, a co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, hasn't passed a single piece of legislation during his 16 years in Congress. Mr. Jordan's fans in the chamber applauded as if that's something to celebrate. When Mr. Aguilar noted later that Mr. Jordan introduced a bill to ban abortion nationwide, a smattering of the same Republicans cheered. It's possible that Mr. Jordan could prevail on the holdouts in future ballots, pointing out that the House remains without a speaker, preventing Congress from acting on Ukraine aid, an Israel package, border measures, or the federal budget, funding for which runs out next month. But his pressure campaign against anti-Jordan Republicans, which is being assisted by the right-wing media, cemented some lawmakers into their position. If just 5 Republicans stay firm against Mr. Jordan, of the 22 who broke with him on the second ballot, he cannot become Speaker. This seems increasingly likely. Fortunately, there is a sensible alternative on the table that would give House Republicans time to regroup and find a more suitable long-term leader, without ignoring the nation's business. Representative Mike Kelly, Republican, Pennsylvania, is circulating a resolution that would temporarily expand the powers of Speaker pro tempore Patrick T. McHenry, Republican, North Carolina, until November 17, when the government will shut down absent congressional action, or until a new speaker is elected. Former House Speakers John A. Boehner, Republican, Ohio, and Newt Gingrich, Republican, Georgia, endorsed this idea. Mr. McHenry, the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, is well respected by all factions of the GOP conference. The bow-tie-wearing 47-year-old has shown respect for the institution and increasing seriousness since first being elected in 2004 as a 29-year-old. Crucially, on January 6, 2021, he voted to accept the results of the 2020 election when the majority of House Republicans sought to disenfranchise the people of Arizona and Pennsylvania. But it is unclear exactly how much authority Mr. McHenry currently has to oversee the House's operations. Mr. Kelly's resolution would expand Mr. McHenry's powers by temporarily declaring him the elected Speaker pro tem rather than the designated one. This would empower him to begin negotiations with the White House on an emergency aid package and to avert a shutdown. It might also allow him to join sensitive intelligence briefings for the Gang of 8 congressional leaders. Mr. Jordan's allies present a false choice to Republicans, arguing that a temporary Speaker McHenry, rather than a permanent Speaker Jordan, would mean caving to the left. But Mr. Kelly's resolution would not require Republicans to bring Democrats into a governing coalition, which House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat, New York, proposed in a post-op-ed. Instead, it would restore some semblance of functionality as Republicans get their own House in order. Mr. McHenry could direct fellow GOP committee chairs to advance appropriations bills and a supplemental funding package to help Israel and Ukraine in their hours of need. And he could bring them to the floor for an up or down vote. For their part, many House Democrats want to hold out for significant concessions from Republicans, such as additional seats on key committees, before supporting Mr. Kelly's plan, which at least some Democrats would need to support for it to pass. But if they can stop Mr. Jordan from becoming Speaker, they should take that win. Democrats should vote to make Mr. McHenry the interim speaker if they can secure a promise that he will negotiate in good faith to fund the government beyond next month and advance other proposals with wide bipartisan support. In the process, they would sideline the ultra-right Republicans who have thrown the House into chaos by making irrelevant their votes on who should lead the chamber. Governing by continuing resolution is not ideal in a dangerous world that requires planning for more than just a few months at a time. But keeping Mr. McHenry on for an additional month, or year, is not just better than Mr. Jordan becoming Speaker. It's also a step toward restoring a semblance of regular order and functionality. The time has come for the House to get back to work. The Supreme Court blew a chance to fix its second-worst decision ever. The Supreme Court on October 2 spurned an opportunity to correct the second-worst mistake in its 233-year history. If it had agreed to hear Ursula Newell Davis's case, and had then decided it correctly, the court would have scrubbed a 150-year-old stain from its reputation. And it would have ended the injustice being done to Newell Davis and those whom Louisiana's government is, for its convenience, preventing her from serving. Instead, the court, which is currently accused of insufficient fidelity to precedents, has preserved one that enables government-inflicted abridgments of individuals' rights. The court's worst mistake was Dred Scott v. Sandford, 1857, holding that black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. The Civil War made possible, in 1868, the 14th Amendment, which says no state shall abridge any American's privileges or immunities. The legislative history of the Privileges or Immunities Clause shows that this phrase, written to protect newly freed blacks from states' oppressions, affirmed various fundamental rights of national citizenship. These included those secured by the Bill of Rights, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, and other unenumerated rights derived from the common law and acknowledged by the Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In 1873, however, the Privileges or Immunities provision was all but nullified by a Supreme Court decision preserving a Louisiana government-created monopoly. Some Louisiana butchers contested the monopoly conferred by their state on a single slaughterhouse, saying this abridged their right to earn a living. Ohio's Representative John Bingham, the foremost author of the 14th Amendment's first section, said it was to protect, inter alia, the liberty to work in an honest calling. This fundamental right, which is deeply rooted in this nation's history, is the antonym of the slavery to which the 14th Amendment responded. The court, however, held that privileges or immunities refers merely to a few narrow and obscure federal rights, e.g., protection on the high seas. And earlier this month, the court ratified this 1873 mistake, declining to hear a privileges or immunities challenge to another disreputable Louisiana restriction of economic liberty. Newell Davis, a New Orleans social worker with undergraduate and master's degrees in social work and more than 2 decades of experience, wants to provide respite child care services to parents who have special needs children. But Louisiana's health department requires a facility need review, which evaluates not a caregiver's competence but 4 bureaucrats' determination that the community needs the caregiver's services. By what standard does it measure need? Its own needs. Incredibly, the department says that this barrier to entry into the caregiving field self-evidently serves the public interest by giving department bureaucrats fewer caregivers to scrutinize. Never mind any shortage of Louisiana respite care. Newell Davis is denied government's permission to practice her craft so that government can conserve its regulatory energies. She cannot work at all so that the bureaucrats can work less than they otherwise would. Because the court long ago eviscerated the straightforward privileges or immunities clause, occupational licensing laws have been combated, awkwardly and without sufficient success, as violations of substantive due process. The theory is that the adjective due modifies the noun process. Due process supposedly prevents capricious, arbitrary, and irrational barriers to entry into this or that field. Courts have enforced this only intermittently and uneasily, partly because many are wary of unenumerated rights. In its unsuccessful, but unanswerable, petition urging the court to hear Newell Davis's case, the Pacific Legal Foundation, PLF, skewered Louisiana's nonsense. Under Louisiana's reasoning, government could economize election resources by having fewer polling places. It could enhance the administrative ease of education bureaucracies by educating fewer children. Louisiana's argument, the petition said, is that the department can deprive people of constitutional rights because doing so allows it to oversee fewer people exercising their constitutional rights. The PLF unavailingly reminded today's court that 100 years ago, the court said the right to earn a living is the very essence of the personal freedom that it is the purpose of the 14th Amendment to secure. The court, deferring to its own blunders, chose to preserve a precedent that prevents robust responses to abuses such as Louisiana's abridgment of Newell Davis's rights. The court should have remembered James Madison's admonition in 1792 that it is not a just government, where arbitrary restrictions, exemptions, and monopolies deny to part of its citizens the free use of their faculties and free choice of their occupations. The Biden administration on Wednesday eased oil, gas, and gold sanctions against Venezuela a day after the government of President Nicolas Maduro and the U.S.-backed opposition agreed to terms for a competitive presidential election next year. The Treasury Department issued a general license authorizing U.S. companies to engage in long-barred transactions, primarily in the state-controlled energy sector. It said the license is to be valid for 6 months, to be renewed only if the authoritarian socialist government meets its commitments for elections and with respect to those who are wrongfully detained. The agreement signed by the government and opposition politicians Tuesday, following years of on-again, off-again negotiations, could be a breakthrough in the South American nation's stifling political stalemate. The Biden administration promised to consider suspending some sanctions in exchange for progress. The planned elections deal and the sanctions relief were first reported this week by the Washington Post. Administration officials, who have long insisted that negotiations were only among Venezuelans, denied Monday that any U.S. sanctions deal was part of the package. Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken said Wednesday that the Treasury Department announcement was consistent with our long-standing commitment to provide U.S. sanctions relief in response to concrete steps toward competitive elections and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Other sanctions, he said in a statement, would remain in place. The United States has also conveyed our expectation and understanding that before the end of November, Maduro will define a specific timeline and process for the expedited reinstatement of all candidates in upcoming elections, including all who want to run for president next year, and of level electoral playing field, Blinken said. Venezuela, he said, will also begin the release of all wrongfully detained U.S. nationals and Venezuelan political prisoners. 4 Americans are known to be detained in Venezuela. They include Luke Denman and Aaron Berry, arrested in 2020 for their alleged participation in a failed attempt to capture Maduro. Ivan Hernandez has been charged with criminal association and conspiracy after entering Venezuela during a vacation trip. Jurel Kenamore, 52, was detained by migration officials upon entering the country with his Venezuelan girlfriend. The human rights organization Foro Penal says more than 250 Venezuelans are currently being held for political reasons. A senior administration official said none of the U.S. actions will affect ongoing litigation related to Citgo, the U.S.-based, PDVSA-owned oil refining and marketing company, which is being sued by creditors in U.S. courts, or Venezuelan assets frozen in the United States or elsewhere. The official spoke on the condition of anonymity under rules imposed by the administration. The Maduro government pledged Tuesday to allow all parties to choose their candidates, permit international observers to monitor the vote and grant all campaigns fair access to the media. The government did not promise to lift bans that now prevent some opposition candidates from running. Maduro, speaking during a televised meeting Wednesday evening with members of his government involved in the talks with the opposition, called the lifting of oil sanctions a victory for the country and the product of negotiations with the United States. This path must lead to the complete lifting of sanctions against Venezuela, he said. We are people of our word. What is written and signed is fulfilled. With this license, we are moving forward progressively. The Treasury Department also amended licenses to remove a secondary trading ban on certain Venezuelan sovereign bonds along with debt and equity of PDVSA, the state-controlled oil company. We assess that this, along with the lifting of restrictions on the state gold mining company, would have the positive effect of displacing nefarious players in this market, and with negligible financial benefit to authorities from Venezuela, Treasury said. Maduro, the hand-picked successor to Hugo Chavez, the founder of Venezuela's socialist state, claimed victory in a 2018 election viewed by the United States and other countries as fraudulent. The Trump administration severed relations with the government in 2019, and to existing sanctions added prohibitions barring Venezuelan access to U.S. financial markets. President Donald Trump at times threatened military action against Venezuela, which he accused of plotting against the United States with Russia and Iran, with which Maduro has maintained close relations. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi visited Caracas last summer on his first trip to Latin America. Venezuela boasts the world's largest proven oil reserves, but years of mismanagement and sanctions on the oil sector have brought the economy to a near standstill. More than 7 million Venezuelans, a quarter of the population, have fled the country. While many now live in other South American countries, nearly 500,000 have crossed the U.S. southern border in the last 3 years. They include around 50,000 taken into custody by U.S. agents last month. In another result of talks between Washington and Caracas, the United States on Wednesday conducted its first deportation flight to Venezuela, returning nearly 130 migrants. Herrero reported from Caracas, Venezuela. In the melodrama that saw Jim Jordan coming all too close to being elected Speaker on Tuesday and Wednesday, the country witnessed some of the best of what the U.S. House of Representatives used to be, and the worst of what it is becoming. It does not say much for the narrow Republican majority's capacity to govern that it is entertaining the idea, much less that nearly 90% of its members voted in favor of putting in the Speaker's chair a man who prides himself on having one of the thinnest legislative records in Congress. "I didn't come to Congress to make more laws," Jordan, Republican, Ohio, has said. Even more shocking was that so many were willing to hand power to a conspiracy theorist who worked to overturn an election, who encouraged an insurrection and who, less than 3 weeks ago, voted to shut down the government. This reckless lurch by the vast majority of House Republicans would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Trumpism has seized the House. And yet, as Jordan fell short of a majority in votes by the full House this week, it was heartening to see a handful of his GOP colleagues stand up not only against their increasingly destructive colleagues, but also the pressure of the right-wing noise machine, including the fury that was unleashed on Jordan's behalf by Fox News mega-host Sean Hannity. These 20 or so Republicans might pay a price for the fact that they have genes of rationality and responsibility in their mitochondrial DNA. Those in deeply red districts might draw challenges in next year's Republican primaries. The country owes them a debt. They had different reasons for their refusal to buckle. For some, particularly those vulnerable members who represent districts that Joe Biden won in 2020, it was a calculation of political survival. Others, including a handful of institutionalists on the Appropriations Committee, saw in Jordan's speakership the prospect of regular government shutdowns and budget cuts so deep they would threaten national security at a time when the world is a particularly dangerous. Still others voted against Jordan out of personal loyalty to former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, whose October 3rd ouster was engineered by a small number of lawmakers who have become known as the Chaos Caucus. "What has gone on this past 2 weeks is stunning," said Representative Doug LaMalfa, a staunch conservative whose friendship with McCarthy goes back to their days together in the California legislature and who voted against Jordan during the first round in protest, but not on the second ballot. "Some people don't appreciate being bullied on how they are going to vote, whether it's by a TV host or a flood of emails. What the heck do they want? Do they want to just tear the speaker down? As a matter of fact, some do, which is how we have reached the point where the House has ceased to function. The selection of a speaker is something that traditionally has been a rote exercise and an insider's game. But everyone should have seen this debacle coming. In January, it took McCarthy 15 rounds of voting to win the gavel, which was the first time something like that had happened since the Civil War era. He was the first speaker ever to lose his job by a vote of the House. The backlash against the members who voted to remove McCarthy has been so intense that I have a hunch you won't see another motion to vacate in this Congress, former Speaker Newt Gingrich told me last week. I don't share Gingrich's confidence that the Republicans in the House will settle down anytime soon. It's more likely that this experience will only increase the belligerence of small factions within the party. These hard-right members and their ideological allies didn't succeed in their efforts to install one of their own as second in line for the presidency, But that doesn't mean they will give up on their radical goal of undermining the processes of legislation by consensus for which Congress was designed. Every time lawmakers use these innovations, it becomes easier to use it the next time, notes Clemson University political scientist James Wallner, a Capitol Hill veteran who worked for Republicans in both the House and Senate. Some on both sides of the aisle are trying to cobble together an agreement under which Speaker pro tempore Patrick T. McHenry, Republican, North Carolina, will have the power to bring at least some legislation to the floor, particularly aid that is urgently needed by Israel. But the fact remains that the Republican majority has ushered the House into an era unlike any it has ever experienced, one in which lurching from crisis to crisis is the only way it operates, when it operates at all. Israel was judged guilty of bombing a Gaza hospital before the evidence was in. In their compelling new book, Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, retired General David Petraeus and historian Andrew Roberts write, there are currently 5 widely recognized dominions of warfare: land, sea, air, cyber, and space, but it appears that a 6th should be added, namely information, which is more important now than ever before. Indeed it is, and nothing better illustrates their point than the current Israel-Hamas war, and in particular, the controversy over the explosion at a hospital in the Gaza Strip on Tuesday. There have been many stories in recent days on the difficulties that the Israel Defense Forces will encounter in mounting a ground assault into the dense urban terrain of the Gaza Strip, and those difficulties are considerable, given that Hamas is holding at least 199 hostages and has built an extensive network of tunnels where its fighters can hide. But this conflict is more likely to be decided in the realm of information warfare than urban warfare. Hamas recognizes the importance of the battle of the narrative. That's why its terrorists were equipped with GoPro cameras during their murderous rampage through southern Israel on October 7. Some of their footage quickly found its way to social media. But showing terrorists killing innocent civilians is hardly the way to win the world's sympathy, which is why the Israeli government itself released some captured footage of atrocities. Hamas did not score a significant information warfare victory until Tuesday's explosion at Al-Ali Hospital. The Hamas-controlled Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza immediately blamed the blast on an Israeli airstrike and claimed that 500 civilians had been killed. This breaking news was immediately, and credulously, picked up by Western news media. BBC alert: hundreds of people have been killed in an Israeli strike on a hospital in Gaza, according to Palestinian officials. Even U.S. allies such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia stridently denounced the purported Israeli airstrike. The leaders of the Palestinian Authority, Egypt and Jordan cancelled a planned meeting with President Biden. Angry protesters marched everywhere from Beirut to Baghdad. Yet, a few hours after the initial news, a competing version of events emerged. Israeli spokesman claimed the casualties were caused not by an Israeli bomb but by a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that went astray. Israel even released a purported intercept of 2 terrorists discussing the terrible accident. Independent open-source intelligence analysts such as Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat and former UN war crimes investigator Mark Garlasco joined in to say their examinations of photos and videos of the blast site did not reveal the kind of crater that an Israeli bomb would have left. While visiting Israel, Biden backed up its claims, saying the U.S. Defense Department had told him that the other team was responsible for the blast. The U.S. intelligence community also absolved Israel, and, after reviewing its findings, so did the Senate Intelligence Committee. The definitive verdict has yet to be rendered, but it seems fair to say that Israel has a strong case. It has presented evidence backed by outside analysts, and Hamas has not. And yet much of the world did not wait for a fuller picture to emerge before rushing to condemn the Jewish state. This is not a new experience for Israel. In 2002, when the Israel Defense Forces responded to suicide bombings in Israel by attacking Palestinian militants in the Jenin refugee camp, Palestinians claimed 500 civilians had been killed, and that report was picked up around the world. The United Nations later found that 52 Palestinians had been killed, and a maximum of 26 might have been civilians. But few noticed the UN findings. Israel, as a small liberal democracy in need of international support, is sensitive to global opinion in a way that despotic states such as Russia, which deliberately targets civilians in its military operations, are not. In 2006, Israel faced irresistible pressure to end its offensive against Hezbollah after an Israeli bomb struck an apartment building in Qana, Lebanon, killing 28 people, lower than initial estimates of 54 dead but still appalling. I am not one of those who takes an Israel right or wrong approach. I have not been hesitant to call out Israel for its misdeeds, whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's assault on democracy or Israel's expansion of settlements in the West Bank. And I recognize that Israel does not always tell the truth. The IDF at first denied that one of its soldiers had shot and killed a Palestinian-American journalist last year before belatedly setting the record straight. That initial, inaccurate response left Israel with a credibility gap on Tuesday. I note, too, that some of the initial reports about Hamas atrocities on October 7 were exaggerated or uncorroborated. Both sides engage in information warfare. I also disagree with Uberhawks such as Senator Tom Cotton, Republican, Arkansas, who said on Sunday, Israel can bounce the rubble in Gaza. Anything that happens in Gaza is the responsibility of Hamas. While Hamas wantonly violates the laws of war, Israel has an obligation to obey them, and that means doing everything possible to minimize civilian casualties and to provide humanitarian relief even though Hamas hides among civilians. Based on my reporting on Israeli military operations over the years, I believe the IDF does recognize its obligation to uphold the laws of war, even if some far-right firebrands in the Netanyahu government do not. But, of course, in the heat of battle, even the best-intentioned militaries will kill civilians by accident, and it is imperative to hold them to account. In sum, I am not suggesting that anyone should uncritically accept whatever Israel says. But that same skepticism should certainly extend to Hamas, a terrorist organization that is not noted for its devotion to either honesty or human decency. The battle of the narrative is more important than ever. That makes it all the more imperative that the world, journalists especially, not echo the claims of either side without first checking them out. In a conflict already freighted with allegations of war crimes, a strike on a Gaza City hospital on Tuesday evening has divided opinion, set back hopes for a diplomatic end to fighting and deepened global anguish over the prospect of more civilian deaths. The early evening blast at the Al-Ali hospital killed 471 and injured over 300, a spokesman for Gaza's Ministry of Health, Ashraf al-Qudra, told The Washington Post. Palestinian and Israeli officials blame each other for the strike. In the immediate aftermath, Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that controls Gaza, said an Israeli airstrike was responsible for the destruction at the medical facility. Hours later, Israel's military announced that a rocket fired toward Israel by the Islamic Jihad, a smaller Palestinian militant group, had hit the hospital. The blast was the single deadliest incident of civilians in Gaza since the war began, coming 10 days after Hamas's October 7 cross-border attack on Israel. Israeli authorities said Hamas's attack killed 1,400 people and resulted in 200 others taken hostage. Israel has carried out retaliatory airstrikes in Gaza that local authorities say have killed at least 3,400 people. What is the Al-Ali Hospital? The Al-Ali Hospital is located in central Gaza City, the largest city in the Gaza Strip. The hospital is owned and operated by the Diocese of Jerusalem, a local branch of the Anglican Communion, one of the world's largest Christian groups. The hospital has 80 beds and handles around 4,000 patients, 300 surgeries and 600 radiological visits each month, according to the Diocese of Jerusalem. The hospital also provides free care for burn injuries and malnourished children, as well as food and psychosocial support. Eileen Spencer, head of the American fundraising arm for the diocese, told The Washington Post after the strike that it was Gaza's only independent, Christian-led medical facility. The Al-Ali Hospital was spending an average of $1,800 a day on diesel fuel to run its generators up to 20 hours, according to the American fundraising arm. Following the Hamas attacks on Israel, Gaza has come under regular airstrikes. The Israel Defense Forces said last week that it had struck over 2,600 Hamas targets, but mosques, residential buildings, international aid group offices, and more than 10 hospitals in Gaza have also been damaged. Israel's military ordered the evacuation of more than 1 million people in the northern Gaza Strip, including Gaza City, last week, describing it as an effort to avoid harming civilians. Hamas dismissed the warnings as psychological warfare and told residents to stay. Aid groups criticized Israel's evacuation order, saying it would be impossible to move hundreds of thousands of civilians, including those being treated at hospitals, to Gaza's south. Hundreds of families, including children, women, and the elderly, had been sheltering in and around the hospital at the time of the blast, according to first responders and aid groups. What did Palestinian sources say happened? Around 6:59 p.m. local time Tuesday, there was a blast at the hospital site. In one video verified by the Post, there is the sound of an object whirring through the air, followed by a blast, with fire and orange plumes of smoke coming from Al-Ali. Soon after, reports spread of a mass casualty event at the hospital, with officials in Gaza stating that Israel was behind the strike. Israeli warplanes bombed Al-Ali Arab Hospital, Baptist Hospital, in the center of Gaza City, resulting in the martyrdom of 500 Palestinians, including children and women, Palestine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said on social media. Israel has crossed all red lines, said Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, adding that targeting the hospital was a hideous war crime. Abbas, who is based in the West Bank city of Ramallah, is a member of Fatah, a longtime Hamas political rival. Hamas also pointed the finger at Israel, calling the strike a crime of genocide. The Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, initially said Tuesday that 500 people had been killed in the strike. The next day, the ministry revised the figure down to 471. What do Israeli sources say happened? Shortly after accounts of the strike spread Tuesday, Israeli military officials said they would investigate. Within hours, Israel said it had evidence that it had not struck the hospital. Instead, it said the blast at the medical facility was the result of a failed rocket launch by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a smaller militant group. A spokesman for Islamic Jihad denied allegations that the group was responsible for the attack, according to Reuters. Speaking to reporters Wednesday, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, an Israel Defense Forces spokesman, said that the explosions were caused by rocket propellant in the misfired missile, which made a larger explosion than the warhead of the rocket itself. Israel's government said a barrage of rockets was fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad at the time of the strike on the hospital. It also released audio clips of what it claimed was a taped conversation between Palestinian militants discussing the misfire. The Post was not able to independently verify the audio clips. Hagari said Wednesday that intelligence revealed that Hamas had attempted to spin the fatal blast into a global media campaign to hide what really happened and to inflate the number of casualties. What has the United States said about the attack? The strike on Al-Ali Hospital preceded President Biden's trip to Israel, part of a broader visit to the Middle East planned in response to the visiting Israel on Wednesday. Biden told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that based on what I've seen, the strike appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. Biden told a reporter that he had seen data from the Pentagon that suggested Israel was not culpable. Netanyahu later said in an address that he had shown Biden conclusive evidence that Islamic Jihad was behind the blast before the U.S. president departed for Israel. Adrienne Watson, spokeswoman for the U.S. National Security Council, said in a Wednesday statement that the U.S. government assesses that Israel was not responsible for the explosion at the hospital, citing available reporting, including intelligence, missile activity, overhead imagery, and open-source video and images of the incident. The statement added that the explosion appears to be the result of an errant rocket fired by a terrorist group in Gaza, and we are continuing to work to corroborate whether it was a failed PIJ rocket. What information has been verified so far? The Post, like other international news organizations, has no access to the hospital site as the borders to Gaza through Israel and Egypt are closed. Images and video from Tuesday evening show a midair burst followed by a large blast at the hospital seconds later. An independently verified video shows corpses strewn on the grass outside the Al-Ali Hospital parking lot on Tuesday night. Other videos from the scene showed men, women, and children, some covered in dust and blood, being rushed to the nearby Al-Shifa hospital. Footage of Al-Ali from Wednesday showed the hospital's parking lot blackened and filled with burned-out cars. The Post is unable to accurately verify the final death count and has to rely on local organizations. What wider impact could there be? There has been immediate diplomatic fallout, with neighboring countries blaming Israel for the strike. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan tweeted that hitting a hospital containing women, children and innocent civilians is the latest example of Israel's attacks devoid of the most basic human values, while Saudi Arabia called it a heinous crime committed by the Israeli occupation forces. The reaction may spell the end to a period of warming diplomatic ties for Israel across the region. Biden had been scheduled to travel to Amman with the leaders of Jordan, Egypt and the Palestinian Authority to discuss the Israel-Gaza conflict, but the summit was cancelled hours after the strike on the hospital. Overnight Wednesday, major protests erupted across the Middle East, targeting not just Israel, but also the United States, with Western embassies drawing angry crowds. Meg Kelly, Elise Samuels and Imogen Piper contributed to this report. Jordan denounces threats against Republicans who oppose his speaker bid. Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, denounced the barrage of threats and calls Republicans say they've fielded since opposing Jordan's nomination to be the next House Speaker, saying that no American should be harassed for their beliefs. Jordan lost a second round of votes for the speakership, receiving one fewer vote on Wednesday's ballot than he did Tuesday. Though he flipped 2 Republican votes in his favor on the second ballot, he lost 4 of his GOP colleagues. Representative Mariannette Miller Meeks, Republican, Iowa, said in a statement that after she flipped from voting for Jordan on Tuesday to another Republican, Representative Kay Granger, Texas, on Wednesday, she received credible death threats and a barrage of threatening calls. No American should accost another for their beliefs, Jordan said on X, formerly known as Twitter, after Miller Meeks's announcement. We condemn all threats against our colleagues, and it is imperative that we come together. Stop. It's abhorrent. Miller Meeks was among a number of lawmakers who voiced concerns about threats and harassment they had received after voting for speaker candidates other than Jordan. According to MinnPost, phones in the office of Representative Pete Stauber, Republican, Minnesota, rang off the hook Wednesday after he joined the Republicans opposing Jordan's speakership. A Stauber staffer told MinnPost that most callers were upset with the congressman's vote. The staffer added that most calls came from outside the lawmaker's district. Representative Steve Womack, Republican, Arkansas, told reporters after Wednesday's vote that the opposition to the Ohio Republican among the expanding group of lawmakers who voted against him is profound. Womack, who voted for Representative Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, on both ballots, argued that the Republican opposition to Jordan was not coordinated but rather an organic development among members from different committee assignments, tenures, and states. The commonality between them, Womack said, was frustration with Jordan's hardline reputation and the tactics he has employed to win over support. After the vote, Representative John Rutherford, Republican, Florida, elaborated on some of the threats that have been leveled at his staff and placed the blame squarely on Jordan for facilitating a culture of aggressive and extremist rhetoric. He is absolutely responsible for it, Rutherford said of Jordan. And look, it doesn't work, especially against people like Stephen, Scalise, and others. Nobody likes to have their arm twisted. Talking about individuals' wives and those sorts of things? That's just not acceptable. Rutherford appeared to be referring to the anonymous texts sent to the wife of Representative Don Bacon, Arneb, urging her to talk to her husband into supporting Jordan. Texts to Bacon's wife were reviewed by the Washington Post. One urged her to tell the congressman to step up and be a leader, while another asked her why her husband is causing chaos by not supporting Jim Jordan. It's wrong that folks have no boundaries anymore, Bacon said Wednesday. We don't live in fear, but holding people accountable is needed. The Idaho Republican Party said in a news release Wednesday that it, too, had been inundated with emails and phone calls from registered Idaho voters expressing their profound disappointment with Congressman Mike Simpson's decision today. That decision? Voting for Scalise for a second time in as many days. The people of Idaho expect Mike Simpson to represent their concerns and prioritize their needs above political games and partisan divisions, the statement continued. The true measure of his success will be in his steadfast defense of the Constitution and the tangible benefits he delivers to the hardworking families of Idaho. We will be watching. As Jordan sought to shore up support among the GOP ranks ahead of the first vote on his speakership, the Washington Post previously reported, he and his allies mounted a pressure campaign that included having Fox News host Sean Hannity call at least one swing district Republican to push a vote for Jordan, and pushing Jordan's right-wing supporters on social media to urge conservatives to call their representatives about voting for Jordan. While some Republicans, in the wake of Jordan clinching the speakership nomination after Scalise withdrew last week following a failed campaign to gather the 217 votes necessary to claim the gavel himself, argue that Jordan has charted a more pragmatic political course within their conference over the past few years, others say they are skeptical that the founding member of the hard-right House Freedom Caucus has softened his ways. Womack noted that the members who were against Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, for Speaker in January all wanted something in exchange for their vote, while those who are against Jordan now don't want anything from him, underscoring the challenge Jordan faces in trying to flip the holdouts. He added that the threats that had been leveled against him and his staff from Jordan supporters and allies represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics at play and only hardened opposition to Jordan. Representative Jen A. Kiggins, Republican, Virginia, who voted for former Speaker McCarthy on Tuesday and Wednesday, said on X after Jordan lost a second time that threats and intimidation tactics will not change my principles and values. And Granger, a key appropriator who cast votes for Scalise on both ballots, explained in a social media post that hers was a vote of conscience and I stayed true to my principles. Intimidation and threats will not change my position, she said. Lee and Caldwell contributed to this report. State Department official resigns, citing objection to Israel arms transfers. Josh Paul's exit marks a rare public show of internal dissent from the Biden administration's robust support for its closest ally in the Middle East. A State Department official who worked on arms transfers to foreign powers resigned Wednesday over the Biden administration's handling of the conflict in Israel and Gaza, declaring he could not support further U.S. military assistance to Israel and calling the administration's response an impulsive reaction based on intellectual bankruptcy. The official, Josh Paul, was Director of Congressional and Public Affairs at the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which handles arms transfers. His departure marks a rare measure of internal discomfort over the administration's robust support for Israel, the United States' closest ally in the Middle East. More broadly, it was an unusual public show of dissent within President Biden's foreign policy apparatus, which has worked to prevent such expressions of frustration from spilling over into view. Paul had spent more than 11 years in his role, which coordinates relations with Congress and public messaging for a key office that deals with military aid. He said that he could not countenance continuing in a job that he said was contributing to the deaths of Palestinian civilians. Let's absolutely note the horror of what Hamas did, and the scale of it. And therefore I fear the scale of the potential Israeli response or ongoing Israeli response, Paul said in an interview. I recognize the Israeli government's right to respond and to defend themselves. I guess I question how many Palestinian children have to die in that process. Paul said the robust U.S. military assistance for Israel was effectively giving the country a green light to do what it wants against Gaza, regardless of the civilian toll. The Israeli government has declared that it plans to destroy Hamas and has told the residents of Gaza City and northern Gaza to move southward, a request UN observers have declared will create a humanitarian disaster. The State Department declined to comment, citing policy on discussing personnel matters. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spent the last week hopscotching the Middle East in a bid to create regional support for Israel's right to defend itself and avoid a regional war, but also to push Israel to respect humanitarian concerns in Gaza. Biden, visiting Israel on Wednesday, declared that the United States is going to stand with you. But he urged Israelis to draw a distinction between Palestinians and Hamas, and to minimize civilian casualties. The vast majority of Palestinians are not Hamas, he said. Palestinian people are suffering greatly as well. Paul said that he had encountered other dilemmas while working on military assistance inside the State Department, but that he had always felt he could bend things in the right direction. Not so this time, which was the biggest reason he resigned, he said. There's no questioning on this one. There's no space for substantive dissent within the system on this one. And that's what led me to my decision, he said. He said there wasn't a single precipitating moment that led to his resignation Wednesday, simply the feeling of being party to a slew of decisions that he disagreed with and felt powerless to influence. Although State's Bureau of Political Military Affairs also has had a major role in arms transfers to Ukraine after Russia invaded last year, Paul's academic background and career has long intertwined with Israel and the Palestinian territories. He wrote his master's thesis about Israeli counterterrorism and civil rights, he said, and worked in Ramallah, in the West Bank, on security sector governance with the Palestinian Authority. And, in his resignation letter, he said he had deep personal ties to both sides of the conflict. Paul said he spent last week on a pre-planned leave, giving him more space to watch what was happening from the outside and to contemplate his decision. Since he publicly announced his resignation in a 2-page declaration posted on LinkedIn, he said he had received many expressions of support from State Department colleagues. "What I've heard is, 'Thank you, we're with you,' all that sort of thing," he said.